Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, I would love to know where you all are watching from. Now, let's jump into today's stories. In pediatric intensive care units, life and death coexist in delicate balance. Monitors beep in rhythmic patterns, ventilators sigh with each breath, and nurses move tirelessly between beds, tending to the tiniest patients with precision and care. But in the early 2000s, one pediatric ICU in San Antonio, Texas, became the scene of quiet terror, where the very person charged with protecting children became the source of their suffering. Reynaldo Munoz was a respiratory therapist, a professional entrusted with ensuring critically ill children received the breathing support and care they needed to survive. Colleagues initially described him as competent, calm, and courteous, qualities ideal in a high-stress ICU environment. He blended easily into the rhythms of the ward, attending to patients, logging vital signs, and assisting with ventilators. To supervisors and parents alike, he was reliable. Yet beneath this facade, Munoz was operating in a chillingly deliberate manner. Investigators later discovered that he had been administering lethal doses of medications to patients, children whose lives depended on precision, care, and trust. Some received overdoses of morphine or fentanyl. Others were injected with drugs that caused sudden cardiac arrests. The result was a string of unexplained deaths that haunted the ICU staff, families, and investigators alike. Initially, pediatric nurses and doctors attributed the deaths to the inherent fragility of ICU patients. Critically ill children, especially those with respiratory or cardiac complications, sometimes deteriorate unpredictably. But the pattern of mortality linked to Munoz could not be ignored. A disproportionate number of children under his direct care experienced rapid, unexplained declines, often during shifts when he was responsible for medication administration. Parents who lost children described confusion and heartbreak. They recalled staff performing resuscitation, sometimes successfully, sometimes too late. Some children were stabilized only to suffer a second, often fatal, episode hours later. In the chaos of the ICU, it was nearly impossible to discern that the same hand causing harm was also part of the team responding to the emergencies. Hospital administrators began to notice discrepancies in medication logs, particularly with controlled substances. Syringes went missing, quantities did not match recorded administrations, and errors in documentation were frequent, but always conveniently linked to Munoz's shifts. Internal audits highlighted concerning patterns, though the staff initially hesitated to confront him directly. He was calm, polite, and persuasive, a figure whose authority and reliability made suspicions uncomfortable to articulate. Eventually, the evidence became undeniable. Surveillance footage, medication reconciliation, and corroborating testimonies revealed that Munoz had intentionally administered drugs outside of prescribed protocols. Investigators pieced together a chilling sequence. In some cases, children were suffering from complications unrelated to Munoz's actions, but his interventions, precisely timed overdoses, ensured that deterioration became fatal. One particularly harrowing case involved a toddler recovering from a respiratory infection. Monitors indicated gradual improvement, oxygen saturation rising, heart rate stable. Yet after a dose of morphine administered by Munoz, the child suffered cardiac arrest within minutes. Staff scrambled, performing CPR, but the child could not be revived. When reviewing the medication log, investigators noted discrepancies that aligned perfectly with Munoz's shifts. Interviews with Munoz revealed a man both calm and manipulative. He minimized concerns, claiming mistakes were accidental, that high-stress ICUs led to documentation errors, or that adverse events were beyond his control. Yet forensic evidence and pattern analysis told a different story. The timing, type, and distribution of lethal doses were too consistent to be coincidental. The investigation extended beyond the hospital. Prosecutors collected witness statements, cross-checked medication inventories, and conducted a detailed review of ICU patient outcomes. Each death was analyzed, revealing that the mortality rate during Munoz's shifts was statistically and tragically anomalous. Families were brought in to testify, recounting the rapid and unexplained deterioration of their children, often moments after routine care. Ultimately, Munoz was convicted on multiple counts, including murder and criminally negligent homicide. Sentencing reflected both the number of deaths and the betrayal inherent in targeting vulnerable children, patients who depended entirely on adult guardians for survival. His conviction sent shockwaves through the pediatric and hospital communities, raising urgent questions about supervision, access to controlled substances, and the mechanisms by which staff could act without oversight in critical care settings. The repercussions extended far beyond the courtroom. Hospitals across Texas and the United States re-examined ICU protocols, implementing tighter controls on medication access, enhanced monitoring systems, and mandatory checks when administering high-risk drugs. Staff training emphasized the need to report unusual patterns immediately, even when the person involved was trusted, respected, or previously reliable. Yet the human toll remained profound. Families of victims experienced grief compounded by the realization that the person tasked with care had caused death. ICU staff wrestled with guilt and disbelief, knowing that their systems, though robust, had allowed one individual to operate with devastating autonomy. Children who survived required intensive rehabilitation, both physically and emotionally, from the consequences of negligence and intentional harm. The Munoz case is remembered not for dramatic confrontations or sudden violence, but for its quiet, insidious horror. It illustrates how trust, authority, and isolation within a high-stakes environment can be manipulated. It demonstrates that even in a place dedicated to life, one person's actions can tilt the balance toward tragedy. Walking through pediatric ICUs today, monitors continue their steady rhythm. Ventilators sigh with every breath, and nurses move attentively from bed to bed. But the story of Reynaldo Munoz remains a haunting reminder. Vigilance, oversight, and courage to question authority are as essential to patient safety as the medications, machines, and expertise that sustain life. In the quiet hours of the night, the memory of those children lost under his care lingers in the minds of staff, a sobering testament to the consequences of trust betrayed. Rostov, industrial city, bleak in winter, factories belching smoke into gray skies. People moved with a sense of urgency, heads down, avoiding the biting wind. Life carried on, routine and monotonous. But somewhere within the crowds, danger lingered unseen. Andre Chikatilo lived quietly in a modest apartment on the outskirts. A schoolteacher by day, polite, almost invisible to his neighbors. Married, unremarkable, seemingly ordinary. He attended church, exchanged greetings, and helped when asked. Ordinary. Yet behind this facade, an obsession grew, quiet and persistent, shaping his thoughts and desires in ways no one suspected. His first known murders began in the late 1970s. Victims were children or young women, often alone, often vulnerable. Chikatilo observed their routines carefully. He waited. He studied. He learned the exact times they traveled, the streets they took, the moments when nobody would see them. Patience became a weapon. He would approach them gently, offer help, guidance, even friendship. Promises of candy, small jobs, or companionship. Trust was the bait, and it worked with cruel efficiency. Once isolated, the violence was swift and merciless. Strangulation, stabbing, sometimes mutilation. He sometimes took body parts as trophies, arranging them in ways that revealed both compulsion and method. Each act carefully executed, each murder leaving only the faintest trace behind. The Soviet authorities were slow to react. Disappearances were scattered across towns, often months apart. Police assumed children had run away. Young women were missing. Perhaps they had left home for work or moved in with relatives. The system failed to recognize the pattern. Chikatilo moved through Rostov and its surrounding towns like a shadow, taking advantage of their blind spots. He became a ghost in plain sight. Polite at work, courteous at home, unremarkable on the streets. Yet his nights were consumed by stalking, selecting, planning. Forests and train stations became hunting grounds. Isolated fields became places of horror. He adapted to avoid detection, shifting tactics whenever suspicion arose. Over the years, his crimes escalated. He learned to manipulate fear and silence. He could lure his victims into compliance without struggle. He understood how to exploit authorities' assumptions. The police would never suspect an ordinary man, a teacher, a neighbor. And so he continued, unobserved, with horrifying consistency. Chikatilo's capture came in 1990. An attempted abduction went wrong. The victim escaped. Police were alerted. A network of investigations finally began to connect the dots. Evidence that had once been invisible now became tangible. Witnesses came forward, patterns emerged, and the authorities realized the full scope of the horrors that had occurred over more than a decade. When arrested, Chikatilo remained calm, unshaken. His confessions were chilling in their matter-of-fact detail. He recounted victims, locations, and methods with eerie precision. He spoke of control, of compulsion, of the irresistible drive that had dictated his actions for years. His words revealed meticulous planning, the kind that left no room for mistakes, except for the one that led to his capture. The trial revealed the scale of his crimes. At least 52 confirmed victims, many more suspected. Families were devastated, communities shaken. The courtroom was filled with journalists, experts, and relatives. Each recounting, each exhibit, painted a portrait of a man who had moved undetected for years, hiding murder behind ordinary routines. His mild demeanor made the brutality of his acts all the more horrifying. Experts studied him extensively. They examined the psychological factors that contributed to his behavior: childhood trauma, social isolation, maternal domination, and a compulsive need for control. Yet even the most detailed analysis struggled to explain the combination of patience, cunning, and brutality that defined his crimes. He was ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in the capacity for cruelty. The methods Chikatilo employed were a lesson in predation. Victims were isolated, subdued, and murdered with deliberate efficiency. He chose locations carefully, often in dense forests or near abandoned buildings, places where the chance of discovery was minimal. He moved bodies, manipulated evidence, and changed routines to avoid suspicion. His ability to plan and execute across years and locations is what made him exceptionally dangerous. Even today, the city of Rostov carries echoes of those crimes. Streets, forests, train stations, ordinary places made sinister by the memory of what occurred. Chikatilo's life shows how someone can blend seamlessly into society while hiding a darkness so extreme it reshapes our understanding of trust, safety, and perception. The horror is methodical, not sudden, not overtly theatrical. It creeps, it hides, it manipulates the ordinary, using invisibility as a tool. The butcher of Rostov's crimes were invisible to the casual eye, embedded in the normal flow of life. The city functioned around him, while he harvested victims, each act deliberate and precise. Walking through Rostov today, the factories still smoke. Streets bustle with pedestrians. Life continues, but one can imagine the shadows in the fields, the isolation near train tracks, the quiet, calculated movements of a predator who once moved freely, unseen, among ordinary citizens. Andrei Chikatilo's legacy is not sensational headlines or cinematic spectacle. It is a chilling study of method, patience, and invisibility. Ordinary life and extraordinary evil coexisting in the same space. The terror lies in the quiet execution, the patience, and the careful control over life and death. In Vienna, Austria, the Lane's hospital stood as a modern medical facility. Sterile corridors, fluorescent lights, and the quiet hum of machinery. For patients, it was a place of care, recovery, and hope. But during the 1980s and 1990s, a team of nurses and aides, later dubbed the Lane's Angels of Death, turned those same corridors into the site of systematic murder. The team operated with chilling coordination. Their leader, Nurse Maria Gruber, orchestrated the movements of her colleagues, selecting vulnerable patients, often the elderly, critically ill, or immobile. Using sedatives, insulin, and other medications, they administered fatal doses, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes subtly, ensuring that deaths would appear natural. Hospital staff initially noticed little. Patient deaths in intensive care or geriatric wards were common. Heart failure, infections, and complications from chronic illnesses claimed lives regularly. The pattern of multiple deaths on certain shifts went largely unnoticed. To outsiders, nothing seemed amiss. The victims were often those least able to defend themselves. Patients with dementia, bedridden individuals, and those requiring extensive nursing care were particularly targeted. The perpetrators exploited routines, medication rounds, vital sign checks, and nighttime monitoring. When a patient's heart stopped, it appeared to be the inevitable result of age or illness. Investigators later discovered that the Lane's Angels of Death had killed at least 49 patients, though estimates suggest the true number may have been higher. Many of the deaths occurred within hours of administering insulin or other drugs capable of inducing hypoglycemia. Some patients were found comatose, others dead, and in nearly every case, the medical charts indicated no cause for immediate suspicion. The team's methods were calculated. They used their knowledge of physiology and pharmacology to select drugs and dosages that mimicked natural decline. In some cases, nurses would administer extra doses during busy shifts, blending lethal acts into routine care. Their coordination allowed them to deflect attention from any individual, making discovery difficult. Whispers among staff began long before investigations took place. Certain nurses noticed unusual patterns, patients slipping away under particular shifts, medications missing from supply rooms, or charts that seemed inconsistent. But fear of confrontation, hierarchy, and the perceived respectability of senior staff prevented early reporting. The exposure came after relatives noticed a strange frequency of deaths and pressed for investigations. Autopsies revealed insulin-induced hypoglycemia in patients without diabetes. Internal audits confirmed discrepancies in drug administration logs. Once authorities began scrutinizing patterns, the network of nurses and aides became evident. Maria Gruber and her accomplices were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Trials revealed the chilling rationale behind the killings. Some claimed they were easing suffering. Others appeared motivated by psychological compulsion or a desire for control over life and death. Their calm explanations during court proceedings contrasted starkly with the suffering they had caused. Sentences were severe. Long prison terms and life sentences reflected both the scale of the murders and the betrayal of trust. The case prompted Austrian hospitals to tighten drug administration protocols, increase oversight, and implement monitoring systems capable of detecting unusual patterns of patient mortality. The victims' families were left to grapple with the aftermath. Many had assumed that their loved ones were under competent care, only to discover that those entrusted with life had facilitated death. The horror of systematic, coordinated killing within a hospital, a place inherently associated with safety, was profound and enduring. Even decades later, the Lane's Angels of Death remain a grim chapter in medical history. The hospital corridors, once the site of invisible killings, carry the weight of memory. The story of how trust, professional authority, and access to vulnerable patients were manipulated continues to resonate, illustrating the chilling reality of what can occur when the boundary between care and harm is deliberately crossed. Our next story continues in Vienna. Streets winding through old neighborhoods, cobblestones slick with rain. Cafes glowed with soft light. Patrons whispered, sipping coffee, reading newspapers, absorbed in ordinary life. Crime was distant. Stories belonged on the page. And yet, lurking just beyond that distance was Jack Unterweger, a man who lived in plain sight. Unterweger was celebrated once. A writer, a journalist, a man of charm, wit, and intellect. He wrote about crime, about society, about the darkness he claimed to despise. He was revered in literary circles, appearing in cafes with a notebook, discussing philosophy and morality. Ordinary, polished, cultured, invisible, but his life concealed contradictions. As a young man, he had committed violent crimes and was imprisoned for murder. Years in jail hardened him, shaped his perspective, and, paradoxically, elevated his public persona upon release. He became a model of rehabilitation in the eyes of the media, a symbol that even the darkest past could be reformed. He exploited this perception skillfully. Public appearances, interviews, and published essays all cultivated trust. Authorities, colleagues, and readers believed in his transformation. Few suspected that behind his charm, old compulsions still simmered. Unraveling returned to criminal activity with methodical precision. His victims were primarily women, often sex workers, whom society had marginalized. He studied routines, observed habits, and selected targets with care. Isolation was key. Shadows, alleys, and empty streets became his hunting grounds. The violence was swift, practiced, and terrifyingly controlled. He struck with instruments that allowed quick, effective domination. The murders were intimate and personal, often strangulation, sometimes blunt force, sometimes both. He concealed bodies, erased evidence, and moved through cities with the same calm that had once made him a celebrated figure in literary circles. What made Unraveling particularly dangerous was his dual life. By day, he was a public intellectual, attending readings, social events, and journalistic gatherings. By night, he reverted to calculated predator, exploiting invisibility and trust. His ordinary demeanor became a camouflage, his charm a weapon. Police investigations struggled for years. Patterns were inconsistent across cities. Vienna, Graz, Prague, even American cities briefly intersected with his movements. By avoiding predictable locations and timing, he complicated detection. Each act was deliberate, yet designed to appear isolated. The geography of his crimes masked method with randomness. Eventually, suspicions crystallized. Bodies were connected through forensic evidence and witness accounts. Unraveling's public persona began to unravel as investigators pieced together timelines and locations. His charm could no longer shield him. Ordinary gestures, once disarming, became sinister in retrospect. When apprehended, Unraveling remained composed. Interviews revealed intelligence, introspection, and control. He admitted to multiple murders with disturbing calm. Forensic reconstructions, timelines, and confessions created a chilling portrait of a man who had mastered both public perception and predation. His trial captivated the public. Courtrooms filled with journalists, former admirers, and victims' families. The contrast between his literary fame and the horror of his crimes created an almost surreal tension. Evidence of premeditation, methodical planning, and psychological manipulation was meticulously presented. Each detail underlined his ability to blend into society while executing acts of lethal violence. Unraveling's story demonstrates how duality can be lethal. The same mind that crafts beautiful prose can plan and execute murder with precision. Trust and invisibility became tools. Ordinary routines, social engagement, and literary fame hid extraordinary evil. Ordinary life continued outside the courtroom, even as extraordinary violence unfolded in parallel. Even after conviction, the echoes of his crimes persisted. Neighborhoods where he had hunted remained wary. His case became a study in criminology, psychology, and the sociology of perception. How can someone so visible, so celebrated, commit atrocities unnoticed? How does society mistake charm for reform, visibility for safety? The horror of Jack Unraveling is subtle, quiet, and persistent. He moved through streets, cafes, and public spaces unnoticed. He operated with patience, method, and control. Ordinary life surrounded him. Yet ordinary life was not safe. His story is a reminder that danger can wear a friendly face, speak with cultured words, and participate openly in society while harboring lethal intentions. Vienna streets still carry the echoes of his actions. Old neighborhoods, rain-slicked cobblestones, cafes and squares. Ordinary settings that once masked extraordinary evil. Shadows fall differently when one remembers that the predator may have walked just ahead, unnoticed, blending seamlessly with the crowd. Jack Unterweger's life does not thrill with gore. It unnerves with subtlety, calculation, and the terrifying efficiency of a dual existence. Ordinary and extraordinary, visible and invisible, safe and deadly, sometimes simultaneously. That is the legacy of the journalist turned killer. The Andes Mountains stretch like a jagged spine along the western edge of South America, their peaks cloaked in mist and clouds, their valleys dotted with small villages where life moves slowly and traditions persist. To the casual traveler, the mountains are breathtaking, a testament to the beauty and resilience of nature. Yet, hidden among the villages and remote communities, a darkness moved almost invisibly, preying on those who were most vulnerable. Pedro Alonso Lopez, born in Colombia in 1948, grew up in an environment marked by poverty, neglect, and trauma. Orphaned and exposed to cruelty from a young age, he developed patterns of behavior that would later manifest in the most horrifying ways. By his adolescence, Lopez was already exhibiting violent tendencies, but the scale and intensity of his crimes would escalate far beyond what most could imagine. He became one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, known as the Monster of the Andes. His victims were almost exclusively young girls, often from impoverished or marginalized communities, whose disappearances drew little attention in towns struggling with scarcity, crime, and limited law enforcement resources. In the eyes of Lopez, these girls were expendable, invisible, and tragically easy to manipulate. Lopez's method was both opportunistic and calculated. He would seek out girls walking alone, sometimes inviting them to help with errands, offering gifts, or promising employment. His charm, combined with his understanding of fear and trust, allowed him to lure victims without immediate suspicion. Once isolated, he would commit acts of unimaginable violence, killing and often leaving the bodies in remote areas, their remains sometimes hidden or buried. The scale of his crimes is staggering. Investigations estimate that he may have murdered over 100 girls in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in modern history. The sheer number is difficult to comprehend. Over 100 lives extinguished, families devastated, communities forever scarred. Yet even more chilling is the fact that he operated across borders, moving with an unsettling freedom that allowed him to continue his killings without immediate capture. Lopez's arrest came almost by accident in 1980, when he was detained in Ecuador for unrelated criminal behavior. Investigators quickly uncovered evidence linking him to multiple murders, including detailed confessions, maps of burial sites, and knowledge only the perpetrator could possess. The confessions were chilling in their calmness, his tone matter-of-fact, almost devoid of emotion, as he recounted the details of his crimes. For the victims' families, the truth was unbearable. Communities mourned not only the lives lost, but also the realization that a predator had moved undetected through their midst, exploiting vulnerability, poverty, and trust. Each confession, each recovered body, was a stark reminder of the fragility of safety and the consequences of invisible threats. Lopez was tried in Ecuador, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Yet his story does not end neatly with incarceration. He remains a disturbing figure precisely because of the scale of his crimes and the audacity with which he operated. Unlike killers who leave dramatic trails or theatrical evidence, Lopez's methods relied on subtlety, invisibility, and the vulnerabilities of those he targeted. He understood that fear, social marginalization, and the gaps in law enforcement could be exploited to deadly effect. The psychological profile of Lopez has fascinated criminologists for decades. Experts point to childhood trauma, early exposure to violence, and a lack of empathy as contributing factors to his development as a serial killer. Yet even with these explanations, The sheer brutality and methodical nature of his crimes are difficult to reconcile with ordinary human understanding. His actions challenge assumptions about morality, safety, and the thin line that separates normalcy from monstrous behavior. For communities in the Andes, the shadow of Lopez's crimes persists. Parents teach their children caution, villages remain vigilant, and the memory of those lost lingers in collective consciousness. The mountains, once serene and majestic, became silent witnesses to horrors that unfolded away from public view. And even now, the landscapes carry an eerie weight when recalled in the context of Lopez's actions. The story of Pedro Alonso Lopez is horrifying not only because of the number of victims, but because of the quiet, almost invisible way he moved through communities. His crimes were not immediately sensational. They unfolded in whispers, in missing children who vanished without explanation, in grief that communities struggled to articulate. It is a reminder that evil can exist quietly, without spectacle, and often preys on the powerless, the overlooked, and the marginalized. Even today, when reading accounts of his crimes, there is a profound sense of unease. Lopez's life and actions raise questions that have no easy answers. How could such a man operate across borders without detection? How many more lives might have been saved if circumstances had been different? And how does one reconcile the presence of humanity with the capacity for such deliberate, extensive violence? Walking through the villages he terrorized, or imagining the quiet paths he used to lure victims, it is impossible not to feel the chilling tension between everyday life and the hidden dangers that once existed in the shadows. The Andes remain majestic, resilient, and beautiful, yet the memory of Lopez's crimes persists as a subtle, haunting undercurrent, a quiet horror embedded in the history of these communities. Pedro Alonso Lopez's story is not one of dramatic chases or cinematic confrontations. There were no heroic interventions, no immediate justice for each crime as it occurred. Instead, the horror lies in the methodical exploitation of vulnerability, the calculated predation across borders, and the slow accumulation of tragedies that devastated families and villages. It is a story that lingers quietly and persistently in the mind of anyone who hears it. A reminder that the darkest evils often move in silence, unseen, and almost impossible to anticipate. Cleveland. Rusted factories line the river. Streets echo with footsteps and distant traffic. Houses sit close together in neighborhoods where families have lived for generations. Ordinary life. Quiet. But in one modest house, darkness lingered unseen. Anthony Sowell lived there. A quiet man by day, sometimes noticed by neighbors, but largely unremarkable. He drank, he worked, he maintained appearances. Polite, almost forgettable. Ordinary. Behind the doors, however, he collected victims. He lured them in, preyed on them, and concealed evidence in ways that would stagger investigators. Sowell's crimes went unnoticed for years. Many of his victims were women struggling with addiction, poverty, or homelessness, people society often overlooks. Their absence initially raised few alarms. Reports of missing women were common in large urban areas, dismissed as routine or temporary. Sowell exploited that indifference, moving with careful stealth. He chose victims selectively. Some were familiar faces from the neighborhood. Others were strangers. He gained trust, offered companionship or shelter, and isolated them in his home. Once inside, violence followed swiftly. Strangulation was the primary method. Bodies were often concealed within his property, hidden in closets, storage areas, or behind walls he would later modify to cover his crimes. Neighbors rarely suspected. Sowell's ordinary behavior, cooking, watching TV, speaking with neighbors, masked the horror inside. The contrast between public normalcy and private brutality heightened the terror. A man could live among ordinary citizens and commit unspeakable acts undetected for years. Police were unaware of the full extent. Victims' disappearances were sporadic, spread over months and years. Initial investigations found no connection. It was only after a report from a surviving neighbor, noticing unusual odors and activity in Sowell's home, that authorities began to uncover the depth of his crimes. The discovery was horrifying. Multiple bodies were found in different parts of the house, some partially decomposed, others concealed in furniture or behind walls. Forensic teams cataloged evidence meticulously. The scale of the killings shocked the city. Sowell had killed at least 11 women, though it is possible there were more. Each act was hidden carefully, methodically, deliberately. Sowell's motivations were complex. Anger, control, and sexual violence intertwined. He acted with a chilling combination of opportunism and planning. Victims were subdued with minimal struggle. Some were familiar, some not. Each killing demonstrated both method and malice, reflecting a mind capable of compartmentalizing horrific actions from ordinary life. During interrogation, Sowell was calm, matter of fact. He described acts with detachment, showing little empathy for victims. Psychologists noted his ability to separate his domestic persona from his violent behaviors. He could be a neighbor, a friend, a family man, while hiding acts of extreme cruelty. The trial drew nationwide attention. Families, journalists, and citizens crowded courtrooms, seeking justice. Evidence was presented in full detail. Timelines, forensic analysis, and accounts of neighbors who had unknowingly witnessed subtle signs of his crimes. Sowell's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the horror he had wrought. His story reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight. Ordinary streets, familiar homes, neighbors who appear normal, all were backdrops for extraordinary violence. Sowell's ability to maintain appearances, to live among ordinary citizens while committing crimes, amplified the fear his actions inspired. Even today, the neighborhoods of Cleveland carry echoes of his crimes. Houses, streets, and local parks, ordinary places, are marked in memory by terror. Survivors and families continue to grapple with absence and loss, and the awareness persists that sometimes danger does not announce itself. It hides, it blends in, it waits. Anthony Sowell's case is terrifying not just for the brutality of his acts, but for the duality of his life. Ordinary and extraordinary, visible and hidden, mundane and monstrous, all existed simultaneously in the same space. That quiet, domestic life alongside lethal intent is what makes his story linger in the imagination. Walking past those streets today, one might see children playing, neighbors chatting, cars rolling by. Everything appears normal, but the house he lived in once held horror beyond comprehension. Ordinary life continued around it, unaware of the darkness within. It is the silent tension between appearance and reality that leaves the most lasting unease. Sowell's legacy is the reminder that ordinary spaces can harbor extraordinary evil, that the familiar can conceal menace, that vigilance is never entirely unwarranted, and that invisibility can be as deadly as weaponry. A predator can live unnoticed for years, exploiting trust, opportunity, and societal indifference. Our next story takes us to a small nursing home in rural Norway, a place meant to feel calm, safe, and predictable. The kind of facility where days pass gently, marked only by the shuffle of slippers and the soft hum of radiators. But for years, beneath that quiet, something else was moving. Something patient, deliberate, and almost invisible. Hospitals have alarms. Emergency rooms have chaos. But nursing homes, they have silence. And silence was Arnfinn Nesset's camouflage. He arrived at the Orkdal Valley Nursing Home in the late 1970s, a soft-spoken, bespectacled man with neat hair and the steady manner of someone who had spent his life in healthcare. He'd been a nurse, then a supervisor, and eventually the director. Colleagues said he was organized, polite, always prepared. He carried his keys neatly on his belt, kept the cupboards locked, the medicine cabinets tidy. He knew every patient by name. From a distance, he was exactly what the facility needed. Dependable, mild, unobtrusive. But death began to follow him. At first, it didn't register. Most residents were elderly, frail, nearing the end of their lives. A few passed away suddenly. Unexpected, but not impossible. Then a few more, and then more still, often within hours of one another, sometimes within minutes. The staff whispered that something felt wrong. Not suspicious, not yet, just wrong. It was the way patients declined, too fast, too uniformly, without the usual signs. One evening, someone would be sitting upright eating porridge, and by morning they would be gone. Narrated recorded the deaths with clinical precision. Heart failure, respiratory arrest, natural causes. He signed the charts calmly, almost neatly. And life in the valley went on. The key to Narrated's method lay behind a locked door, a cabinet only he controlled. Inside were medications for emergencies, sedatives, pain medication, muscle relaxants, and, among them, a vial labeled succinylmethonium chloride. In hospitals, succinylmethonium is used to briefly paralyze a patient so they can be intubated. It stops the muscles from moving, including the diaphragm. In the wrong hands, especially without ventilation, it becomes a weapon. A few milligrams can silence a body from the inside out. Narrated understood that. He had trained in it. He knew that after injection, death looks like heart failure. A frail nursing home resident passing away quietly in bed. No struggle, no bruising, no obvious sign of poison. Simply silence. It was the perfect drug for someone who wanted control without detection. By the early 1980s, whispers had turned into fear. A nurse mentioned that too many residents were dying on Narrated's shifts. Another noticed that he was present during almost every medical emergency, even ones he hadn't been called to. Someone else remembered that Narrated had once hinted, half-jokingly, that many residents would be better off if they were gone. But whispers are not evidence, and very few people wanted to imagine what the worst possibility might be. Then there was the matter of the will. One resident, an elderly man with no family, had left a will naming the nursing home director, Narrated, as his beneficiary. It seemed strange. Stranger still when people learned that Narrated had helped him finalize the document days before the man died unexpectedly. It was enough to tip the balance. Police were notified. Investigators came quietly. Two men in plain clothes visiting the facility under the guise of reviewing procedures. They asked questions, looked at logs, noted the number of deaths. Narrated remained polite, helpful, even gracious. He poured them coffee. He answered every question calmly, never once raising his voice or appearing flustered. But his hands trembled. One of the detectives noticed. He wrote it down. The investigation expanded. Autopsies were ordered on recently deceased residents, a delicate task, given their age and frailty. But in one case, the results were unmistakable. Traces of succinylmethonium in the tissues. A drug that should never have been administered in a nursing home. A drug that Narrated had access to, and no one else. On a cold February morning in 1981, officers arrived at the facility before dawn. Nurses watched from behind curtains as they led the director out. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just walked between them, hands clasped, coat buttoned all the way up. At the station, the questioning began gently. How long had he been in charge? What were the standard procedures? Why were there discrepancies in the medication logs? Narrated deflected. He denied everything. He said he had cared deeply for his residents. But the investigators kept coming back to the drug. The access logs, the sudden deaths, the will. Hours passed. Narrated remained composed. But as evening fell, he asked for a glass of water. And then he started talking. Not confessing, not at first. Just talking. He rambled about stress, about responsibility, about the weight of caring for the helpless. Then he said something odd. Some people don't have much left. Sometimes it's kinder to help them along. The room went still. The detectives leaned in. Slowly, almost wearily, Narrated began listing names. 18 at first, then 30, then more. By midnight, he claimed responsibility for 27 deaths. In later interrogations, he changed the number again, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. At one point, he suggested the count was 66. No one knew if he was exaggerating or minimizing. The records were incomplete. Many bodies had already been cremated, but investigators believed the true number could be far higher. What they knew for certain was that at least several had died because of Neset's injections. And that was enough. The trial drew national attention. Norway, quiet, orderly, low-crime Norway, suddenly confronted the possibility that one of the most prolific healthcare killers in Europe had operated undetected for years. Witnesses described Neset as polite, intelligent, composed. A man who kept the floors clean and the cupboards organized. A man they had trusted. Family members of the deceased cried softly in the courtroom. Some stared at him, waiting for him to look back. He never did. Doctors explained how suxamethonium works, how it stills the muscles, how it leaves almost no trace, how a patient simply stops breathing as if falling into a deeper sleep. Nurses testified about the pattern of deaths. Clerks testified about the will. Pharmacists testified about the missing vial. And Neset, he sat with his hands folded in his lap, blinking slowly, as if listening to a story that had nothing to do with him. In 1983, the court delivered its verdict. Arnfinn Neset was convicted on 22 counts of murder, the maximum that could be proven, and sentenced to 21 years, the highest penalty possible in Norway at the time. 21 years, for a man believed to have taken dozens of lives. The courtroom reacted with shock. Some cried out. Others simply stared. But Neset showed no emotion. He nodded politely, stood, and let himself be escorted away. In the years that followed, the facility was reorganized. Medication procedures changed. 2 key access systems were established. Staff began tracking who entered drug cabinets and when. It was one of the biggest shifts in Norwegian elder care policy, sparked by a quiet man with a smooth voice and a set of keys that opened every door. As for Neset, he served his time. He was released in the early 2000s under a new identity. His exact location never publicly disclosed. No photographs, no interviews, only rumors. Someone said he worked in a shop. Someone else said he lived alone in a remote cottage. Nothing confirmed. The only thing that remains certain is his legacy, not in the form of notoriety or infamy or books, but in a more unsettling way. The realization that the most dangerous figures don't always hide in shadows or dark alleys. Sometimes they stand in the bright hallway of a nursing home, keys at their waist, clipboard in hand, offering a gentle smile to a resident settling into bed. During the night, the lights dim. The corridors fall quiet. A soft footstep passes a doorway, and one more bed will be empty by morning. On to the next story. It was a quiet, cold evening in Orkdal, a small town nestled in the Norwegian countryside. The kind of place where the streets were lined with snow-laden trees in winter, and the church bells echoed faintly over the frozen landscape. Life here was slow, predictable, and safe, at least on the surface. Behind the walls of a modest nursing home in Orkdal, however, a darkness had quietly settled, one that would linger unnoticed for years, hidden behind the trust that the community placed in those sworn to care for their elderly. Arnfinn Neset, a nurse and later the director of the Orkdal nursing home, appeared to be the very embodiment of professionalism. Polite, precise, calm, he was the man families trusted with their most vulnerable loved ones. But beneath that veneer, there was something far more sinister. Neset's methods were meticulous. Patients under his care did not simply fall ill. They became part of a pattern that, at first, escaped scrutiny. Families would receive calls, a quiet, somber voice informing them that their loved one had passed away, often after a sudden decline. The deaths were attributed to natural causes, the frailty of age, heart failure, infections. No alarms were raised. The hospital records were orderly, the medicine charts precise, the staff unsuspecting. What Neset had discovered, or perhaps perfected, was the power of patience. Slowly, carefully, he administered lethal doses of sedatives, painkillers, or heart medication, the kind that could be mistaken for routine treatment. He became, in the most chilling sense, an unseen arbiter of life and death, deciding who would live and who would die under the guise of care. It wasn't until years later, when an unusually high number of patients began dying under his supervision, that authorities took notice. The first investigation revealed something disturbing. a pattern in the deaths that could not be explained by coincidence. It was not illness alone. The deaths followed a meticulous, almost ritualized timeline. For many families, the realization was horrifying. Their elderly relatives, entrusted to the care of the nursing home, had been systematically killed. Each death had been deliberate, each medication a calculated act. Nesset had murdered dozens of patients over the course of more than a decade, and the small, trusting community of Orkdal was forced to confront a reality that seemed unimaginable. Their caretaker, the man they allowed into their homes and lives, had been a serial killer. When police dug deeper into Nesset's actions, the scale became even more chilling. The official number of victims confirmed by evidence was 22, but investigators suspected that the true count could be closer to 138. Elderly men and women, often bedridden, defenseless, entirely reliant on the very person who ended their lives. Each murder was carried out with clinical precision. The tools were those of a caregiver: syringes, sedatives, and an intimate knowledge of how the body responds to medication. The trial itself was a meticulous affair. Norway, a country with a strong legal system and a cultural emphasis on justice, approached the case with caution and deliberation. Nesset, by all outward appearances calm and cooperative, stood in court while the details of his crimes were laid bare. Families, some still grieving, sat in the gallery, listening as the chronology of deaths was meticulously recounted. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was how easily Nesset had concealed his intentions. His colleagues reported him as competent and attentive. The deaths were never immediately suspicious. In many ways, his crimes exploited the very trust that forms the foundation of caregiving. The nursing home was supposed to be a place of comfort, a final sanctuary for those in the twilight of life. Instead, it had become a chamber of quiet, calculated death. During testimony, the calculated nature of Nesset's actions became evident. He chose his victims with apparent detachment, sometimes selecting those who were less likely to be missed or whose deaths would attract minimal attention. The sedatives were administered in dosages designed to mimic natural decline. Even for trained medical professionals reviewing the records, the deaths initially appeared consistent with the patient's conditions. In the courtroom, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Expert witnesses explained the toxicology results, the patterns of repeated administration of drugs, and the unnatural clustering of deaths around Nesset's shifts. Families recounted the subtle but disturbing changes in their loved ones: sudden sleepiness, unexplained confusion, a quiet surrender to mortality that seemed at odds with their previous vitality. The Norwegian public followed the case with a mixture of fascination and horror. Newspapers detailed the careful, almost surgical methods Nesset used, painting a portrait of a man who transformed the act of caregiving into something monstrous. Experts in criminology and psychology weighed in, attempting to understand how someone could reconcile empathy for the elderly with deliberate murder. Some suggested a desire for control. Others speculated on a pathological satisfaction derived from the unobserved power over life and death. Sentencing brought its own form of closure, though it could never undo the suffering. Nesset received a life sentence, the maximum penalty under Norwegian law at the time, and was removed from society permanently. Yet the legacy of his actions lingered in the memories of families and colleagues, in the halls of the nursing home, in the public consciousness of Norway. Perhaps the most unsettling element of this story is the quiet normalcy in which the crimes were committed. There are no dramatic confrontations, no sensationalist theatrics. Instead, there was a steady, almost banal progression of death, hidden in plain sight by procedures, forms, and the unquestioning trust of a community. It is a reminder of how cruelty can hide behind calm, competent faces, and how vigilance, the willingness to question and observe, is sometimes the only barrier between life and a premature, preventable death. Even today, discussions of Nesset's crimes are accompanied by a sense of disbelief. How could a person, entrusted with the most vulnerable, systematically end their lives? How could a community be so unaware for so long? And yet, the evidence is clear. The deaths were intentional, the methods precise, and the pattern undeniable. The story of Arnfinn Neset remains one of Norway's most chilling modern true crime cases, a case that continues to haunt the idea of safety in institutions designed to protect the weak. Walking through the quiet corridors of modern nursing homes, one cannot help but feel a trace of unease. The machines hum, the antiseptic smell lingers, and the clock ticks with a steady rhythm. It is routine, it is care, it is trust. And as the case of Arnfinn Neset reminds us, it can also conceal something far darker, hidden in plain sight. Next story takes us to Italy, in the historic city of Forlì, a place where narrow cobblestone streets wind past centuries-old buildings. The rhythm of life carries a quiet beauty. Cafes hum with conversation, church bells mark the hours, and life seems, at least to the casual observer, orderly and serene. It was here, in one of the city's modern hospitals, that a darkness quietly unfolded, one that would shake the trust of families and the medical community alike. Daniela Paggiali, a nurse with an unassuming demeanor, seemed devoted to her work. Colleagues described her as diligent, attentive, and conscientious, the sort of professional whose presence reassured patients and families alike. She wore her uniform neatly, moved calmly through the hospital corridors, and engaged with patients in a way that conveyed both competence and empathy. Yet, beneath this exterior, a series of deliberate, calculated acts were taking place. Acts that would later reveal one of Italy's most disturbing medical crimes. The method was deceptively simple. Paggiali, using her intimate knowledge of patient care, administered potassium chloride, a substance that, in precise dosages, could stop the heart. In the sterile environment of a hospital ward, where life and death often exist side by side, these deaths were initially indistinguishable from natural cardiac failure. Elderly or critically ill patients simply slipped away. Under her watch, their passing attributed to the inevitable progression of disease. At first, no one suspected that these deaths were anything but tragic coincidences. In hospitals, mortality is a familiar presence. Families accept the fragility of life, and staff witness loss on a near daily basis. Yet, subtle anomalies began to surface. Patients who had been stable suddenly deteriorated. Hearts that had once been steady slowed abruptly. Nurses began to notice patterns. Deaths clustered around Paggiali's shifts, unusual changes in patient charts, and medication records that did not always align with standard protocols. What made the situation all the more chilling was Paggiali's demeanor. She maintained an outwardly calm, even cheerful presence, showing no outward signs of stress or guilt. To the families of her victims, she was the person they trusted most, the caregiver who attended to their loved ones' needs, monitored their conditions, and provided reassurance during moments of fear. This trust, once placed, became the very conduit for harm. Investigators eventually pieced together the pattern. By comparing medical records, toxicology reports, and the timing of deaths, they realized that at least 7 patients had died as a direct result of Paggiali's actions. Those suspicions extended to more. She had exploited her role as a nurse to commit murders that were virtually invisible, taking advantage of a system where oversight was limited and trust was presumed absolute. The trial that followed captivated Italy and sent ripples throughout the medical community. Testimony painted a stark picture, a nurse whose skills, knowledge, and attention to detail were weaponized. Toxicology reports confirmed the presence of potassium chloride in the bloodstream of patients whose deaths had initially seemed natural. Witnesses described Paggiali's interactions with patients as professional, but occasionally punctuated by moments that, in retrospect, seemed oddly detached, almost mechanical. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the apparent lack of motive in the conventional sense. There was no financial gain, no personal vendetta, no immediate benefit to herself. The prosecution and psychological experts suggested that the crimes may have been driven by a combination of psychological factors, a need for control, a morbid fascination with life and death, and an eerie compulsion to witness mortality under her own direction. For families, The revelation was devastating. Grief was compounded by disbelief. The woman who had comforted them, who had reassured them in moments of vulnerability, was responsible for ending lives. There were no dramatic confrontations, no visible struggle, only the haunting realization that death had been intentionally delivered by a trusted caregiver. In court, Paggiali's demeanor alternated between composed and defensive. She acknowledged some actions but denied intentional murder, framing her interventions as part of routine care, even when evidence suggested otherwise. The courtroom, filled with grieving relatives, medical professionals, and journalists, became a space where calm professionalism collided with the horror of deliberate, methodical killings. The sentencing reflected both the severity of the crimes and the need for justice in a system built on trust. Paggiali received a significant prison term, ensuring that she would be removed from any role of responsibility over patients. The case also prompted broader discussions within Italy's healthcare system about oversight, monitoring, and the vulnerabilities inherent in placing complete trust in medical professionals. For those who study true crime, Paggiali's story is unsettling precisely because it operates in plain sight. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries of healing and compassion, places where life is preserved rather than ended. Yet she exploited that environment, turning routine care into a tool of death. Every injection, every vital sign charted, every moment of patient observation was a potential opportunity to exercise control over life itself. Walking through hospital corridors, one might notice the hum of ventilators, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, and the quiet diligence of staff attending to patients' needs. It is a world of calm professionalism, of subtle routines, and of trust. And yet, Paggiali's actions serve as a chilling reminder that within such spaces, evil can manifest quietly, invisibly, and devastatingly. The psychological examination of her actions remains as haunting as the deaths themselves. Experts debate whether Paggiali was motivated by a compulsion to control, a morbid curiosity, or a combination of factors beyond easy comprehension. Unlike overtly violent criminals, she did not seek attention, did not leave traces, and did not exhibit outward malice. Instead, the horror lay in her ability to manipulate trust and exploit vulnerability, a quiet, calculated presence in the lives of the sick and elderly. Even decades later, the corridors of hospitals in Forlì carry an echo of unease. Nurses, doctors, and patients alike are reminded of the thin line between care and harm, and of the human capacity for cruelty cloaked in professionalism. Daniela Paggiali's story is not sensationalized. It is quietly horrifying, documented in court records, medical reports, and the testimonies of those who survived, those who lost loved ones, and those who witnessed the unfolding of this silent terror. It is a story of trust violated, of life taken under the guise of care, and of a calm, orderly world infiltrated by deliberate, methodical death. And in the quiet of a hospital night, as monitors hum and footsteps echo along empty corridors, it is impossible not to feel the shadow of what once occurred. A reminder that the most unsettling horrors sometimes exist not in the chaos of violence, but in the quiet, controlled moments of life itself. Next story takes U.S. to Ontario, Canada. Autumn in Ontario has a certain hush to it. The trees along suburban streets blaze with red and gold, and the crisp air carries the faint scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. On the surface, the neighborhoods are tranquil, almost idyllic, the kind of place where doors are left unlocked and neighbors greet each other with genuine warmth. Yet, within this calm, a chilling reality was quietly taking shape in the halls of long-term care facilities. Elizabeth Wetlaufer was a registered nurse, entrusted with the care of elderly and vulnerable patients. To those around her, her colleagues, her supervisors, and the families of her patients, she appeared conscientious, attentive, even compassionate. Her demeanor was warm, her manner professional, the sort of presence that put families at ease during their loved ones' most fragile moments. But beneath the surface, a darkness lingered. Over the course of several years, Wetlaufer methodically ended the lives of at least 8 patients under her care, and she later confessed to attempting to kill 6 more. The weapon of choice was deceptively simple: lethal doses of insulin, a substance commonly used to manage diabetes. In skilled hands, it is life-sustaining. In hers, it became a tool for murder. The method was disturbingly subtle. Patients who were stable would suddenly exhibit confusion, collapse, or slip into hypoglycemic shock. Their conditions deteriorated quickly, often interpreted as a sudden natural decline due to age or pre-existing conditions. For families, the deaths appeared tragic but unremarkable. For colleagues, the losses were attributed to the inherent vulnerabilities of long-term care patients. It was only when patterns began to emerge, clusters of deaths associated with her shifts, unexpected hypoglycemic episodes, and unusual insulin administrations, that suspicion arose. Hospital administrators and investigators were forced to confront a terrifying possibility: that someone entrusted with life and care was deliberately ending it. The investigation into Wetlaufer's actions revealed a chilling portrait of calculated murder. She had developed a method to conceal her crimes within the ordinary operations of the facilities where she worked. Patients' conditions were fragile. Medical documentation often allowed for discretion, and staff oversight, while diligent, was insufficient to detect her actions immediately. Each death was carried out with a precision that minimized the chance of detection. Wetlaufer later confessed to her crimes, offering insights into her psychological state. She admitted to killing patients over a period of years, often citing motives that included personal frustration, a desire for control, or, disturbingly, a compulsion to act in secret. Unlike many serial killers whose crimes are motivated by revenge or financial gain, Wetlaufer's actions were inexplicably personal, deeply intertwined with her professional role and her access to vulnerable individuals. In the courtroom, the scale of her crimes was laid bare. Families recounted their grief, sharing the sudden, unexplained losses of parents, grandparents, and friends. Medical experts described the physiological consequences of insulin overdoses, the sudden drops in blood sugar, and the ways these deaths could mimic natural causes, making detection exceptionally difficult. Together, these accounts painted a picture of a nurse who weaponized her professional knowledge against those she was sworn to protect. The psychological analysis of Wetlaufer's behavior has been both complex and unsettling. Experts noted a combination of narcissistic tendencies, compulsive behavior, and a troubling detachment from the consequences of her actions. She exhibited a paradoxical duality: a person capable of warmth and professionalism in daily interactions, yet capable of deliberate, methodical murder when unobserved. This duality underscores the horror of her crimes, that such acts can be committed not by an obvious villain, but by someone whose normalcy masks lethal intent. The impact on the community was profound. In the small towns of Ontario, where Wetlaufer worked, families and staff were forced to confront the terrifying reality that trust, once given freely to caregivers, could be violated in the most intimate and devastating ways. Hospitals and long-term care facilities responded with systemic changes: tighter medication oversight, improved documentation, and enhanced monitoring of patient care practices. Yet, the emotional scars left by her actions remain. The story of Elizabeth Wetlaufer is disturbing not only because of the number of lives taken, but because of the quiet, almost invisible nature of her methods. There were no dramatic confrontations, no overt violence, no public spectacle. Instead, there was a slow, insidious manipulation of medical trust, a hidden hand guiding patients toward death under the guise of care. Each act was executed in a clinical, almost bureaucratic environment, where the ordinary routines of patient care became a cover for murder. Walking the halls of long-term care facilities today, one can still sense the weight of responsibility that rests on caregivers' shoulders. Machines hum, medications are dispensed, and staff attend to patients' needs with quiet diligence. But the story of Wetlaufer serves as a chilling reminder that even in environments designed for healing and safety, the potential for harm exists when trust is betrayed. Families who lost loved ones struggle with questions that can never be fully answered. How could someone they trusted so completely harbor such darkness? How many deaths might have been prevented with greater oversight or scrutiny? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how does one reconcile the presence of normalcy and warmth with the capability for deliberate, calculated murder? Wettlaufer's name has become synonymous with the angel of death phenomenon, a term used to describe caregivers who deliberately kill patients under their supervision. Unlike other high-profile cases, the Canadian context, small communities, close-knit hospital teams, and a culture of trust amplified the horror. The idea that death could be administered quietly, methodically, and repeatedly by a trusted nurse challenged deeply held assumptions about safety and care. The trial concluded with Wettlaufer receiving multiple life sentences, ensuring that she would no longer have the opportunity to harm patients. The same hands that administered comfort, measured medications, and soothed the sick were also capable of calculated, lethal action. The quiet, orderly world of healthcare, routines, charts, and quiet diligence became, for those under her care, a theater of death. Even today, the shadow of Elizabeth Wettlaufer lingers in Ontario. Her story is recounted not with sensationalism, but with quiet horror, a reminder that evil can be hidden behind ordinary routines, friendly faces, and the familiar cadence of daily life. It is a tale of trust betrayed, of life extinguished quietly. In the quiet of a Canadian evening, as wind rustles through the trees and the distant hum of daily life continues unabated, one cannot help but feel the echo of those lost. Lives ended not by nature, but by the hands of someone they trusted implicitly. And that echo, subtle but persistent, is what makes this story resonate with a horror that is all too real. The next story will give you the creeps. There's a certain stillness that settles over a hospital after midnight, the kind that feels different from daytime quiet. The halls dim, the voices soften, and the building seems to exhale. Machines keep their steady rhythm, but human movement slows. Most staff go home. Most patients sleep. And in that deep blue silence of the early hours, the people who remain can move almost unseen. That was the world Efren Saldivar preferred. He worked the night shift at Glendale Adventist Medical Center in California, a place where respiratory therapists float between rooms like shadows, checking ventilators, adjusting masks, watching oxygen levels. It's solitary work, a job that relies on trust. Trust that the therapist entering a room is there to help, not harm. Trust that the medications logged are the ones given. Trust that a man in scrubs during the small hours of the night is exactly who he says he is. But trust can be a fragile thing. Saldivar was quiet, efficient. He moved with an almost serene composure. Calm hands, calm voice, calm footsteps. Nurses liked him. Doctors appreciated that he knew his equipment. Supervisors thought he handled pressure well. He was the kind of employee who requested extra shifts and never complained. And yet, for years, patients under his care kept dying. Not in clusters that drew immediate attention. Not in ways that seemed impossible. These were not dramatic code blues with alarms blaring. Instead, they were patients already fragile. The elderly, the chronically ill, the ones with tubes and lines. People whose vital signs could swing unpredictably. When one of them died, everyone understood. When 2 died, they said it was a bad night. When 3 died, they blamed comorbidities. No one thought to look at the calm man standing at the foot of the bed, resetting a machine, writing a note, or adjusting a mask. But some nurses began to notice a pattern. It was never during Saldivar's days off. It was never during the busy afternoon shifts. It was almost always when he worked alone, drifting between rooms where patients depended on airflow and carefully controlled medications. Saldivar sometimes spoke casually, too casually, about patients nearing their end. He had phrases he used, "she's ready to go," or "he won't make it through the night." At first, coworkers brushed it off as clinical realism. People in critical care develop dark instincts. They can read deterioration in a face, a sound, a number. But Saldivar wasn't reading the patients. He was deciding for them. He kept the key to the medication drawer, one that should have required dual access. He knew where paralytics were kept. He understood precisely how long it took for vecuronium or pancuronium to stop someone's breathing if given without ventilation support. And he knew that the cause of death would appear natural. Heart failure, respiratory arrest, complications of chronic illness, quiet endings, unremarkable paperwork, perfect obscurity. In 1997, one of the charge nurses reported her suspicions to hospital administrators. She had seen, too many times, Saldivar entering a room moments before a patient coded. She had watched him remove vials from drawers he had no reason to access. She noticed that he often arrived unusually quickly when a crash team was called. It was like he knew it was coming. But the hospital hesitated. Accusing an employee of harming patients is catastrophic. Careers end. Lawsuits ignite. Administrators decided to monitor him quietly, to review logs, to track medication withdrawals, to gather evidence. For months, nothing concrete surfaced. Suspicion wasn't enough. Saldivar stayed on staff, and patients continued to die. The break came from an unexpected place: Saldivar himself. One night, after years of rumors and administrative pressure, he sat down with hospital security, exhausted, overwhelmed, and perhaps wanting to unburden himself. He confessed, calmly, softly, with the same even tone he used when adjusting ventilators. He told them he had killed as many as 50 patients, maybe more. He called it bringing peace. He said he targeted those who were suffering. He said he had the ability to help them pass quickly. The room had gone still. Security officers stared at him, waiting for him to laugh or say it was a joke. But Saldivar's face stayed serene. Then he listed drugs he used: vecuronium, pancuronium, succinylcholine, all paralytics. He described how he injected them into 4 ports, how he reduced ventilator settings without charting it, how he chose patients based on feeling. He gave the details like someone reciting steps from a manual. When he was done, he folded his hands and looked at the floor. Administrators notified police immediately. But within days of his confession, Saldivar recanted. He said it was a mistake. He said he was depressed. He said he wanted attention, or sympathy, or help. Without hard evidence, the case evaporated. He was fired from the hospital, but that was it. No charges, no arrest, no trial. He walked out the front doors and disappeared into ordinary life. For 2 years, in that time, detectives kept digging. They pulled death certificates, staffing records, medication logs. They interviewed nurses who had been too nervous to speak before. Slowly, a pattern began to solidify. Death clusters around Saldivar's shifts. Inconsistencies in respiratory logs. Missing drugs. Ventilator changes without documentation. But patterns aren't proof. The turning point came when prosecutors obtained the right to exhume several bodies. It was a delicate operation, persuading families, navigating legal barriers, unsealing caskets, and performing tests on fragile remains. Respiratory paralytics break down quickly in the body, leaving faint traces at best. But in one exhumed patient, they found what they needed. Then another, then a third, enough to build a case, enough to bring him back in. Efren Saldivar was arrested in early 2001. When detectives sat across from him in the interview room, the quiet composure was still there, the same soft voice, the same polite demeanor. But now, when they pressed him, he didn't deny everything. Not fully. He admitted he may have ended lives. He admitted he sometimes helped patients along. He admitted he had made mistakes. Again, he spoke about mercy, about wanting to reduce pain, about feeling he had the power to ease suffering, even when no one asked him to. He showed no anger, no fear, no sense of urgency. Just a steady, unnerving calm. This time, prosecutors were ready. Saldivar was charged with multiple counts of murder. In 2002, facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, he entered a plea. He admitted to killing 6 confirmed victims, though investigators believe the number could be dozens higher, maybe near his original claim. The bodies of many suspected victims were cremated long ago. Medical charts from the 1990s were incomplete. Paralytic drugs left little trace. In the end, the court convicted him on the provable cases only. But even those were enough. Saldivar received 7 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never walk free again. Inside the prison system, he was described much the same way he had been in the hospital: quiet, polite, unassuming. The kind of inmate who follows rules, keeps his head down, and blends in the background. A man who moved silently through corridors, just as he always had. Some former co-workers still struggle with the memory of those nights, of seeing him adjust a ventilator, hearing him offer comforting words to a struggling patient, watching him stand at the bedside during a code. He seemed so steady, so calm, so helpful. Only later did they realize they had watched someone orchestrate the emergencies he pretended to respond to. Someone who understood exactly how to slip through the thin fabric of nighttime hospital routine. Someone who preferred the deep silence after midnight, when the halls were empty, the alarms quiet, and the only sound was the soft hiss of oxygen, a sound he knew how to stop. Now, on to the next story. By the spring of 2008, the DaVita Dialysis Clinic in Lufkin, Texas, had begun to feel increasingly unsettled. Not in any dramatic or obvious way, but in the subtler tone staff often sense before anyone says a word aloud. The patients who came there 3 times a week knew the rhythms of the place. The buzz of the chairs, the warmth of the blankets handed out during long sessions, the soft chatter among nurses who try to make the hours pass a little faster. Dialysis is a routine built on precision and predictability, and for years the clinic functioned exactly as it should. Then, almost overnight, that predictability fractured. Patients who had been stable for months suddenly collapsed in their chairs. Alarms sounded more frequently, and not for the usual reasons. Some patients vomited violently without warning. Others struggled to breathe, their oxygen levels dropping with terrifying speed. A few went into cardiac arrest while still hooked to the machines. Nurses rushed from station to station, trying to make sense of the chaos, but no one could identify a cause. Blood work looked strange, but not in ways that pointed to one clear explanation. For a clinic accustomed to routine, it felt as if the ground itself had shifted. None of it made sense, until the staff began to notice who kept appearing just before each emergency. Kimberly Clark Signs had been hired earlier that year. She wasn't the most experienced technician, but she was friendly enough and seemed eager to prove herself. She moved with a kind of restless energy, always circling between machines, picking up tasks that weren't hers, inserting herself into procedures she didn't need to oversee. Some co-workers thought she was simply enthusiastic. Others found her difficult. Her record included prior disciplinary issues at other facilities, small things, but enough to raise eyebrows in hindsight. Still, the clinic was short-staffed. Extra hands were welcomed, and for a while, no one questioned her presence. The incidents began quietly. A patient who fainted. Another who complained that something felt off with the machine. A third whose blood pressure plummeted so fast doctors struggled to stabilize her. It was only when emergency after emergency occurred within the span of a few weeks that patterns started to form. Patterns that pointed not to equipment failure or infection, but to intentional harm. Dialysis machinery is complex, but the concept is simple. Blood leaves the body, runs through a filter, and is returned clean. Every step is monitored. Every tube is visible. Every chemical must be handled carefully. Bleach is used to disinfect lines, but only when the machines are offline. Even a tiny amount left behind can be catastrophic. One nurse, during a particularly frantic shift, noticed something strange. The bleach container, normally full at the start of the week, had been refilled twice in only a few days. That had never happened before. Another staff member recalled seeing Signs carrying syringes near the bleach cabinet. Syringes she shouldn't have been using for any legitimate task. Soon, more co-workers came forward with uneasy observations. Signs lingering beside a patient's tubing when she had no assignment in the area. Signs stepping away abruptly just before a patient began to cough and convulse. Signs offering explanations that seemed rehearsed or oddly cheerful. The clinic director took notice. So did the medical director. And when one more patient collapsed within minutes of Signs handling his machine, they decided to act. Administrators removed Signs from the floor, quietly and without alarm, to avoid frightening patients. She was assigned to tasks far from patient care. But even after she was sidelined, the clinic remained on edge. The medical director contacted state authorities. Investigators arrived unannounced, walking the floor with clipboards and expressionless faces, observing staff routines and reviewing logs. The pattern became clearer with each passing day. The medical emergencies, severe, sudden, and catastrophic, clustered around Signs' shifts. They occurred in chairs she had recently approached. The patients she touched were, overwhelmingly, the ones who had coded. Officials began collecting evidence methodically. They swabbed machine parts. They drew blood from survivors. They interviewed staff members individually to prevent cross-contamination of stories. And when laboratory results came back, the findings were unmistakable. Multiple patients had bleach in their bloodstream. Not trace amounts. Not accidental residual contamination. Significant doses. Enough to cause immediate respiratory failure, heart arrhythmias, and death. Enough that no other explanation could be defended. Signs was arrested in April 2008. During questioning, she oscillated between indignation and calm dismissal. She denied harming patients. She denied mishandling bleach. She denied every allegation with a confidence that made some investigators wonder whether she believed her own story. But the evidence continued to build. Survivors described the burning sensation that shot through their veins. Nurses described seeing Signs holding syringes that contained no medication. Others noted her being near machines moments before the alarms erupted. Then there were the logs, detailed, time-stamped records showing exactly where Signs had stood, which machine she touched, and how many times bleach was accessed during her shifts. None of it aligned with her explanations. All of it pointed in the same direction. The case moved quickly. At trial in 2012, prosecutors presented a meticulous narrative built from medical reports, chemical analysis, staff testimony, and Signs' own behavior. Jurors listened to descriptions of patients who had gasped for air seconds after Signs walked away from their stations. They saw charts mapping the spikes in emergencies to her presence. They heard from experts who explained how bleach reacts when introduced into a bloodstream. The immediate destruction of red blood cells, the collapse of organ function, the rapid drop in oxygen. Several survivors took the stand, their testimony quiet but devastating. One said it felt as if her chest had caught fire. Another described watching Signs adjust her tubing and, minutes later, feeling like she was drowning from the inside. A third recalled seeing Signs smiling to another nurse as his body began shaking uncontrollably. None of their accounts contradicted one another. None wavered. Signs' defense team struggled. They argued machine malfunction. They tried to cast doubt on the reliability of bleach testing. They suggested the hospital wanted a scapegoat. But every alternate explanation they offered unraveled under scrutiny, collapsing under the weight of the timeline and the chemistry. When prosecutors revealed security logs showing Signs had searched online for phrases like poisoning patients, the defense had little left to stand on. Kimberly Clark Signs was convicted of killing 5 patients and attempting to kill 5 more. She received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring she would never return to a clinic, a hospital, or any environment where vulnerable people might depend on her. The verdict brought closure, but not full understanding. Many families still wondered why it happened. Why someone working in a place defined by routine and healing would take advantage of that trust. There was no clear answer. Signs never offer a motive that made sense. She never expressed remorse. She simply vanished into the prison system, where she remains as quiet and opaque as she was during those months at the dialysis clinic. Meanwhile, the DeVita facility overhauled its protocols entirely. Bleach handling procedures changed. Machine cleaning logs were redesigned. Staff training intensified. And for months afterward, patients arriving for treatment looked cautiously at every technician, wondering whether they could trust the hands adjusting their lines. Eventually, the clinic returned to its usual rhythm. The chairs buzzed. The blankets warmed. The hours passed, but for the people who lived through those weeks, the memory lingers. The sudden alarms, the panicked shouts, the feeling that something in the room had shifted the moment a single technician walked close enough to touch a tube. Our next story does not begin with a scream or a crash of alarms, but with the soft, familiar glow of a nursing station lamp. One of those quiet, honey-colored lights meant to soothe more than illuminate. In the long-term care homes of Ontario, that glow became a kind of second sun, rising not with the morning, but with the nurse who moved through the halls long after most had fallen asleep. There was a time when Elizabeth Wettlaufer seemed like the perfect fit for places like Kara's Home and Meadow Park. Middle-aged, soft-spoken, the kind of nurse who remembered birthdays and kept track of which residents liked their pillows folded and which preferred the television left on for background noise. She had that calm, almost motherly manner that made families feel safe leaving their loved ones there. But nursing homes live in a strange half-world, too quiet to ever feel truly alive, too full of fragile bodies to ever feel entirely safe. Night shifts especially. The hum of fluorescent lights, the soft whir of oxygen machines, the distant shuffle of someone awake when they shouldn't be. It's in those margins that something was beginning to slip. Wettlaufer had started drinking heavily years before. Pills, too. Not enough to get her fired, but enough to put a haze over her judgment. Enough to create a zone of emotional numbness. She felt overwhelmed by the suffering around her, she later said. Felt chosen, in a way, to ease that suffering. It was a sentiment that would have sounded compassionate if it didn't end the way it did. Her method was almost disarmingly simple. Insulin, a quiet biochemical switch that could send a frail, elderly resident into a fatal spiral of confusion, sweating, rapid breathing, then silence. In long-term care, where comorbidities are stacked like fragile dominoes, hypoglycemia often blends in the background. A sudden decline wasn't unusual. A rapid change at 3 a.m. wasn't suspicious. And insulin, in the hands of someone who knows how to use it improperly, leaves almost no trace. Each time she injected someone, the home would fill with the usual rituals, staff hurrying to the room, whispered updates, notes scrawled across charts, a doctor called in to pronounce. Then the inevitable. They were old. They had heart issues. They had diabetes. They were declining. Grief came, but suspicion never did. She always seemed to reappear at the center of the commotion in an oddly composed way. Concerned, helpful, answering questions, arranging blankets over bodies that had only minutes earlier been breathing. She prayed with families, signed condolence cards, held hands, and then returned to work the next night, where the hallway lamps hummed softly and carts rolled quietly over polished floors. One of her earliest victims was a woman named Maureen, a resident who had become increasingly confused. Wettlaufer later said she felt compelled to act, a terrible word that would show up again and again in her eventual confession. Compelled, as though by something outside herself. Compelled, as though this were not a decision, but an assignment. That night she drew up a syringe, walked calmly into the shadows of the woman's room, and pushed the plunger down. In another facility months later, it happened again. And again. Different wings, different homes, different patients with different histories. Sometimes they died. Sometimes they survived, but were never quite the same. The pattern only existed in Wettlaufer's private orbit. 8 deaths, attempted murders, and a trail of injuries that stretched across nearly a decade. A decade in which no supervisor, no coroner, no investigator even imagined that the quiet nurse on nights might be the common thread. It was as though the system had been built to fail in exactly the way she needed it to. The truth didn't surface because of a lab result or a suspicious family member. It surfaced because Wettlaufer, weighed down by guilt and whatever internal storm she carried, walked into a rehabilitation center and began talking. Not in small hints, but in full, unnerving detail. She described how she had done it, why she felt driven to do it, how she believed God was telling her to stop and then to start again. The counselor she spoke to couldn't ignore it. Calls were made. Police got involved. When investigators interviewed her, the tone of the room remained strangely quiet. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Wettlaufer spoke with the calm of someone describing a long illness rather than a long crime. She held her hands at her lap. She thanked officers for listening. She referred to the residents not as victims, but as people I cared for. And she explained the injections with unsettling simplicity. The story broke across Canada like a shockwave. This wasn't a case from a distant country or a previous generation. It had unfolded quietly in ordinary nursing homes where families entrusted their loved ones for care. The public wanted to know how it went unnoticed, how charts were signed off without question, how deaths were recorded without deeper review. But the answers were complicated, buried in understaffing, overwork, and protocols that rarely anticipated the possibility of intentional harm. When the case went to trial, families filled the seats. Some cried quietly. Some sat stunned. Some couldn't stay in the room when the details were read aloud. Wettlaufer pled guilty, showing little resistance. She offered apologies, though no one could tell whether they were heartfelt or simply another layer of practice calm. She received a life sentence. Yet in many ways, the weight of the story didn't rest on the courtroom outcome. It rested on the uncomfortable realization of how easy it had been to disappear these deaths into the expected rhythms of elderly care. How a single nurse, carrying her own private turmoil, could step between life and death repeatedly without alarming anyone. And in those facilities, the night shift continues as it always has. Quiet halls, soft lights, the gentle creak of doors pushed open for routine checks. But for those who know the story, that quiet feels different now. No longer simply peaceful, but edged with the memory of what once moved through those dimly lit corridors unnoticed, syringe in hand. Let us now travel to London, 1940s. Fog clings to the streets. Gas lamps flicker. The city is recovering from war, its people wary, cautious. Beneath the surface, life continues. Shops reopen, pubs hum, and ordinary routines persist. But in a quiet workshop in Sussex, John George Hay practiced a different kind of craft. Hay was unassuming, small, polite, with a soft voice. Neighbors found him charming. To some, he seemed harmless. But behind closed doors, he kept vats of acid. Glass tanks, barrels, containers. Clear, menacing, ready. Hay had discovered a method. Dissolve the body. Leave no trace. It was meticulous, clinical, efficient. His first known murder was for money. Hay had debts. Luxury seemed just out of reach. He believed he could acquire wealth quickly. Property owners, wealthy acquaintances, anyone who could be liquidated, figuratively and literally. The method was terrifyingly simple. Invite the victim, gain trust, isolate them, administer a lethal dose of sedatives or poison. Then the acid. Hay would watch patiently as flesh and bone dissolved, a process that took hours, sometimes days. In the end, all that remained was a puddle. Evidence erased. The crime scene disappeared. Hay's first victims were selected with care. A widow here, a wealthy industrialist there. People with estates, savings, or properties. After the murders, Hay assumed their identities, used their funds. He purchased cars, lived comfortably, and maintained the facade of normalcy. Small errands, social gatherings. Occasionally, a charming smile for neighbors. Meanwhile, underneath, he was calculating. Cold, detached. The police were puzzled. People disappeared. Estates vanished. Money flowed into strange accounts. But no bodies, no evidence. The law is limited when the dead cannot be produced. Hay understood this. He exploited it. He manipulated social structures, relying on trust, etiquette, and bureaucracy to shield his crimes. Eventually, mistakes began to appear. Hay became careless. Suspicious behavior drew attention. Investigators noted inconsistencies. Accounts didn't add up. The supposed heirs were missing. Friends of missing victims began asking questions. Slowly, the net closed. The breakthrough came from a gruesome discovery. A piece of metal, a fragment of bone, resistant to acid. Forensic experts confirmed it. Human remains. Hay's perfect system had a flaw. Evidence, though minimal, existed. Once authorities uncovered the first trace, they scrutinized his workshop. Acid vats, residues, tools, journals, every detail meticulously recorded. Hay was arrested. The investigation revealed the full scope. At least 6 murders, possibly more, each executed with calculated precision. His confessions were chilling. He recounted the steps, each victim, each dissolution. He seemed almost proud, detached from morality, focused solely on method. The trial was extraordinary. Hay's calm demeanor contrasted with the horror of his crimes. Courtrooms filled with journalists, neighbors, family members of victims. Detailed accounts of the murders were presented. Acid, sedatives, manipulation. Methodical, mechanical. The audience struggled to reconcile his polite, mild-mannered persona with the monstrosity of his actions. Hay was sentenced to death. Hanging. The sentence was swift. Society demanded closure. Justice in its most direct form. Yet the case continued to fascinate criminologists. The combination of meticulous planning, technical knowledge, and sociopathic detachment created a chilling study of human behavior. Even after the trial, the image persisted. Hay, in his workshop, glass vats, a faint chemical smell in the air, shadows flickering on the walls, the sound of liquid pouring, silence. The city carried on outside, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in quiet corners, behind closed doors, in a world that seemed ordinary on the surface. Hay's crimes are remembered not for brutality alone, but for ingenuity. The calculated nature of his murders, the methodical destruction of evidence, and the cold charm with which he moved through society made him uniquely terrifying. It was not rage, not impulsive violence. It was control, observation, planning, and execution. Walking past similar workshops today, one imagines the clink of glass, the faint smell of chemicals, and the meticulous calculations happening behind the walls. Ordinary rooms, everyday facades, and yet, inside, something unthinkable might have been taking place. Hay's story is a reminder that evil can exist in silence, in normalcy, in the everyday. Alaska, 2001. Snow stretches endlessly. Silent forests. Empty roads. Keyes drives alone. Nobody notices him. Nobody suspects him. To the casual observer, he is invisible. Ordinary. Israel Keyes was meticulous, methodical, cold. Unlike many killers, he did not operate in one city. He did not crave headlines. He studied logistics, geography, timing. Each crime carefully planned. No impulsive attacks. No witnesses left behind. Just disappearance. Control. Execution. Keyes' victims were spread across the United States. Hitchhikers, travelers, people chosen at random. He avoided detection through preparation. He buried kill kits, caches of weapons, tools, and supplies in remote locations years in advance. When he decided to act, he retrieved the kit, moved fast, left nothing behind. The first known murder traced to him was in 2001, but his planning stretched far before that. He avoided patterns, cities, states, seasons. Investigators found no connection at first. It was as if he appeared out of nowhere, then vanished. He studied his victims, observed habits, learned routines. Patience was a weapon. He was silent, polite, unremarkable. Neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances never suspected him. He blended in. Ordinary, trustworthy, and lethal. When he struck, he was precise. Victims were subdued quickly, moved to isolated locations, killed efficiently, sometimes buried immediately, sometimes left for days. Always calculated, always controlled. Keyes' crimes were not public spectacles. No media attention sought. No dramatic confrontations. He avoided risk. Police could not predict him. Patterns were impossible. Randomness masked method. Fear spread quietly, invisibly, across states. Families had no warning. In 2012, Keyes made a fatal mistake. He abducted a woman in Anchorage, Alaska. Unlike his previous crimes, she escaped. Police were alerted. Investigation began. Evidence tied him to prior disappearances. The web of meticulous preparation began to unravel. Keyes was arrested. Calm, polite, cooperative. No outbursts. No panic. Interviews revealed chilling insights. He confessed to multiple murders, spread across the country. Locations carefully chosen. Bodies sometimes never found. The total number of victims remains unknown. Psychologists describe him as highly organized. No remorse. No emotional impulses. Just control. Method. Planning. His ability to compartmentalize allowed him to live an ordinary life alongside extraordinary evil. He traveled, worked, interacted with friends and family, while secretly a serial killer. Investigators discovered evidence of his planning. Maps, notes, kill kits, caches of supplies. Some buried in remote forests. Some left years before use. The patience and forethought were unprecedented. He planned murders like military operations, leaving little chance of capture. The scale of his crimes, combined with precision, makes Keyes unique. He killed without witnesses, spread his crimes across states, avoided detection for years. Each act was carefully concealed. Victims were random, yet selected with thought. Locations chosen with care. Execution clean and controlled. Keyes' story is terrifying because it is invisible. No dramatic scenes, no screaming headlines, just disappearance, absence, silence. Families left with unanswered questions. Investigators left to reconstruct years of hidden crimes. Even in custody, Keyes remained composed. He explained methods, choices, locations. Investigators gained insight into a mind that could operate across time, distance, and geography with chilling efficiency. He revealed motivations devoid of emotion, control, curiosity, compulsion. Keyes ended his own life in jail. Suicide. No trial. No public justice for all victims. Only confessions. Only reconstruction of a network of crimes, meticulously hidden until uncovered. Yet the mystery remains. How many were lost? How many bodies never found? How many lives erased quietly? The terror of Israel Keyes is method, patience, invisibility. He moved like a shadow across states. Ordinary by day, predator by night. His story does not rely on gore or spectacle. It relies on control, planning, and exploitation of trust and vulnerability. Silence becomes the horror. Absence becomes the terror. The United States is vast. Remote forests, empty highways, small towns. Keyes knew this. He used it. He vanished. He struck. He disappeared again. Evidence is scattered. Connections tenuous. Yet the pattern emerges. A man who calculated, studied, and executed with deadly efficiency. For those studying his crimes, the horror is not immediate. It creeps in, slowly, through absence, through meticulous planning, through the realization that a killer moved freely across states, unnoticed. That someone ordinary could hide extraordinary evil. That trust and invisibility could be weaponized with lethal precision. Even today, the thought lingers, a shadow in the forest, a figure on the highway, a stranger who blends in, invisible until it's too late. Israel Keyes perfected this. His legacy is absence, mystery, and meticulous terror. Quiet, calculated, unstoppable, until finally caught. Next story takes us to the shadows of psychiatric care. In the quiet hum of a psychiatric hospital, the world often feels removed from ordinary life. The corridors are sterile, yet echo faintly with the distant murmurs of patients, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, the soft clatter of medical carts. It is a place meant for care, observation, and, above all, safety. But sometimes, the very institutions designed to protect the vulnerable harbor darkness that is almost impossible to detect. Ricardo Caputo, a nurse within such a hospital, was entrusted with patients who depended entirely on his expertise and vigilance. Psychiatric patients, often isolated, vulnerable, and reliant on staff for their most basic needs, placed implicit trust in the people who oversaw their daily routines. Caputo, at first glance, seemed to fit the professional mold perfectly, polite, attentive, and methodical. Yet, behind that professional demeanor, a pattern of lethal behavior slowly emerged, a pattern that would terrify both colleagues and the broader community. The first signs were subtle. Patients began dying under unusual circumstances. Their medical charts noted sudden collapses, unexpected cardiac arrests, or rapid deterioration after receiving routine care. In psychiatric hospitals, where the line between illness and medical complication can blur, such events were initially chalked up to pre-existing conditions or the unpredictable nature of mental health and chronic illness. But over time, the deaths formed a pattern, a clustering around Caputo's shifts, a sequence of events that could not be explained by chance alone. Toxicology reports, medication audits, and internal reviews began to reveal the unsettling truth. Caputo had deliberately manipulated medications and administered lethal doses of sedatives to patients under his care. The psychological toll of psychiatric care is immense, yet Caputo's actions exceeded the bounds of professional misconduct and entered the realm of deliberate murder. Each patient, already vulnerable, became an unwitting victim, subject to the lethal calculations of someone who had complete control over their environment. Families who visited or called for updates believed their loved ones were safe. The betrayal was profound, and the realization of what had occurred would be devastating. Investigators pieced together Caputo's methodology with painstaking care. He chose victims who were unlikely to attract immediate scrutiny, often selecting patients who were minimally communicative or whose deaths could be misattributed to natural complications. He utilized medications in ways that mimicked medical necessity. Sedatives, tranquilizers, and other controlled substances were administered in dosages sufficient to induce respiratory failure or cardiac arrest. The deaths appeared natural on the surface, hiding the deliberate acts beneath layers of routine documentation and bureaucratic oversight. Colleagues described him as calm and efficient. On the wards, he was attentive to patients' needs, meticulous in charting, and cooperative with staff. These outward traits, which should have been reassuring, became part of the mechanism that allowed his crimes to continue undetected. His ability to conceal lethal intent beneath a veneer of professionalism is what made his actions so chilling. The investigation was methodical and deliberate. Internal audits revealed discrepancies, patterns of sudden deaths, and unusual medication administration. Families were interviewed, medical histories reviewed, and colleagues questioned. The more the investigators uncovered, the more the scale of Caputo's crimes became apparent. Multiple deaths over several years, executed with precision, and concealed under the normal routines of hospital life. In court, the evidence painted a portrait of a man whose knowledge of medicine was weaponized against those he was meant to protect. Expert witnesses described the pharmacology of sedatives, the mechanisms by which overdoses could induce rapid death, and how careful record-keeping could mask lethal intent. Families shared their grief, recounting the sudden, unexplained loss of loved ones who had relied on the hospital's care. Caputo's motives were complex and chilling. Psychological evaluations suggested elements of control, a need to dominate, and a detachment from the human consequences of his actions. Unlike other criminals motivated by revenge or financial gain, his acts were rooted in a quiet, methodical compulsion to assert power over life and death. Each act was calculated, concealed, and executed with a disturbing sense of precision. The broader implications of Caputo's actions reverberated throughout the psychiatric and medical communities. Hospitals are designed to protect, monitor, and care for those unable to care for themselves. The betrayal of that trust, particularly within psychiatric care, where patients are often isolated and dependent, is a violation that resonates with both professional and ethical horror. Protocols were reviewed, oversight increased, and systems put in place to prevent such abuses in the future, but the emotional impact could not be erased. Walking through the silent corridors of a psychiatric hospital, the echoes of these events linger faintly in the air. The hum of fluorescent lights, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the occasional soft voice of a patient. All are ordinary elements of care, but in the context of Caputo's crimes, they gain a subtle, unsettling resonance. It is a reminder that even in places designed for protection, vigilance is paramount, and trust, while necessary, must be accompanied by oversight. Caputo was eventually convicted, receiving a sentence that ensured he could no longer harm patients. Justice, in this sense, provided closure in a legal sense, though the psychological and emotional consequences for families and colleagues persisted. For the broader community, the case served as a stark reminder of the vulnerability inherent in institutional care, the thin line between safety and peril, and the quiet capacity for evil that can exist in familiar, trusted environments. The story of Ricardo Caputo is not sensationalist in the traditional sense. There are no dramatic chases, no public spectacle, no immediate confrontations. Instead, the horror lies in the methodical, almost invisible nature of his actions, a slow, deliberate subversion of trust and care executed under the guise of professionalism. It is a type of terror that is quieter, subtler, yet profoundly more disturbing precisely because it occurs within the spaces we assume are safe. Families of the victims continue to grapple with the aftermath, recounting moments of confusion, grief, and disbelief. How could someone they trusted to care for the most vulnerable among them have acted with such deliberate cruelty? How could the routines of care, so ordinary and mundane, become mechanisms for murder? These questions remain, lingering in the collective consciousness of those touched by the case. For medical professionals, Caputo's story remains an important lesson. Vigilance, oversight, and the recognition of subtle anomalies in patient care are essential. It is a reminder that competence and professionalism, while necessary, cannot substitute for scrutiny when lives depend on it. The quiet, controlled environment of a psychiatric hospital, with its routines and protocols, can become a stage for tragedy if trust is exploited. Even today, the corridors where Caputo once worked carry a shadow of unease. Next story takes us to Plainfield, Wisconsin. Small town, quiet streets, red barns, farmhouses set far apart. Life moves slowly. The air smells of earth and wood smoke. Children play along fences. Neighbors wave. Ordinary. Ed Gain lived on the outskirts. A farmhouse surrounded by overgrown fields. Isolated, cold, silent. Inside, his mother's presence still lingered, though she had been gone years. She had instilled fear, control, religion twisted into obsession. Gain absorbed it all. Neighbors knew him as polite, shy, helpful, odd maybe, but harmless. He bought supplies, helped with chores, attended church. Ordinary routines. No one suspected, not even when things vanished. Pets, objects, odd smells. The first signs of darkness appeared quietly. Missing items, small thefts. Gain never left a witness. His crimes were hidden behind the mundane. Out in the fields, in the woods, in his farmhouse. Shadows moved. Objects disappeared. Then bodies surfaced. Victims, local women, sometimes strangers, taken from their homes or wandering the countryside. Gain's method was chillingly intimate. Lure, subdue, kill, move the body, hide, alter, preserve. Inside his home, investigators later found evidence that shocked the nation. Furniture made from human bones, skulls as bowls, skins turned into masks and clothing. Trophies, careful arrangements, every piece cataloged, every artifact meticulously preserved. The farmhouse itself told a story. Small rooms, dim light, every corner concealing secrets. Closets held horror. Drawers contained bones. Cabinets contained tools. Workbenches lined with implements designed for precision. Ordinary materials transformed into instruments of violence. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. The terror was invisible, quiet, embedded in a single household. Gain's outward normalcy camouflaged his actions. The contrast between ordinary life and what occurred behind doors created a lingering unease. Investigators reconstructed the events carefully. Bodies moved, evidence cataloged, each victim traced to its final location. Gain confessed with eerie calm. No dramatics, no theatrics, just method, observation, planning, execution. His trial was extraordinary. Courtrooms filled with journalists, townsfolk, experts. Exhibits displayed. Bones, skulls, preserved skin, objects made from human remains. Gaines sat quietly, almost mundane, ordinary, yet terrifying. Gaines' crimes became a template in criminology, study of psychological isolation, maternal obsession, social withdrawal, delusions, his methods, the level of planning, and the grotesque creativity fascinated experts and horrified the public. Even today, the farmhouse is remembered. Empty fields surround it, windows dark, silence thick. Visitors sometimes report chills, shadows that feel alive, a house that hides memories of violence behind ordinary walls. The horror of Ed Gein is not sudden or chaotic. It is slow, creeping, methodical, hidden in plain sight. A man who blends into society while committing acts incomprehensible in scale and nature. Every ordinary action masked extraordinary darkness. In Wisconsin's cold air, among quiet barns and slow roads, one can almost imagine the farmhouse in its isolation. Doors closed, curtains drawn, silence deep. Inside, a world that seemed mundane but was anything but. The butcher of Plainfield operated where no one would suspect. Ordinary life, ordinary man, extraordinary terror. Some stories begin with alarms, others with a single overlooked moment. This one begins with a night shift lull, the kind every nurse knows well. When the hallways go still, the call lights fade, and the silence of a long-term care home settles like a blanket over everything alive inside it. There are few places as deceptively peaceful as a nursing home after midnight. The televisions are off, the kitchen is dark, the administrative office is locked. The only sounds come from oxygen concentrators humming behind doors and the occasional frail cough drifting down a hallway. In that quiet, trust is absolute. Residents sleep in the belief that the people standing by their beds are there to protect them. At Alpine Manor, a sprawling pastel-painted nursing home in Walker, Michigan, the night shift was handled by a small team of aides. They cleaned, repositioned residents, monitored vitals, and charted meticulously. It was routine work, intimate, exhausting, often unthanked, but deeply necessary. In 1987, two women stood out among the night staff. Gwendolyn Graham, lively and unpredictable, and Catherine May Wood, quieter, heavier, watching everything with a cautious distance. They worked side by side, shared cigarettes outside the loading dock, whispered gossip in the break room, and, eventually, shared something darker than either of them admitted at first. Their relationship began as many workplace romances do. Long shifts together, lingering conversations, a sense of being understood by someone who lived the same exhausting routine. But beneath the surface, something else brewed, something neither woman seemed willing or able to stop once it began. Gwen, the more outwardly bold of the pair, loved attention. Colleagues remembered her as energetic, almost restless, always seeking excitement. Kathy, by contrast, blended into the background, often quiet, often pliable, the type who followed rather than led. Together, they found a strange equilibrium, one that grew more toxic the longer they spent in each other's orbit. It began with fascination, morbid little jokes about death that nurses sometimes make to ease stress, comments about which residents were closest to the end, which ones wouldn't last the night. In most workplaces, the humor stayed harmless, a coping mechanism. But with Gwen and Kathy, it didn't stay that way. One night, Kathy would later testify, Gwen leaned close and whispered an idea. Not a joke this time, not a passing comment. "We could do it," Gwen said. No one would ever know. Kathy didn't respond. She didn't laugh, didn't protest, didn't walk away. Maybe she thought Gwen was trying to shock her. Maybe she didn't take it seriously. Maybe part of her, deep down, didn't want to take it seriously. But the idea stayed. The first victim was a woman suffering from advanced Alzheimer's. She spent most nights wandering in confusion, her memory slipping in and out like a flickering light. The staff kept a careful eye on her, not because she was a danger to others, but because she was a danger to herself. She was frail, disoriented, and dependent on the kind of constant supervision only a night shift could provide. According to Kathy, that night, Gwen directed her into the resident's room. The hallway was empty. The lights were dimmed. The other aides were busy with rounds. "She won't fight," Gwen said softly. "She won't understand." What happened next was simple and horrifying. A hand pressed down across the resident's mouth, another across her nose. The body beneath them struggled weakly, then fell still. They worked in silence, the only sound the mechanical breathing of the oxygen machines in nearby rooms. To anyone else, it would have looked like natural death. The resident had been declining for months. The chart already documented her fragility. There was no reason to suspect anything more. And so no one did. The next morning, the death was logged. A doctor signed the certificate. The staff mourned briefly. Families were notified, and Gwen smiled. At Alpine Manor, death was part of the job. Many residents were elderly, medically fragile, or already nearing the final stages of life. Losing one was emotional, but not unusual, and that made the environment dangerously perfect for what came next. The second victim was chosen just as quietly. Another older woman. Another night where the halls were empty. Another moment when the boundaries of trust blurred into something monstrous. Kathy claimed she felt sick afterward, that she didn't want to keep going. But Gwen coaxed her, reassured her, insisted that they were doing something merciful. But there was nothing merciful about what happened. By the time the third resident died, again on Gwen and Kathy's shift, patterns were forming, but invisible ones. Each death was signed off as natural causes. No autopsies were performed. No investigations were launched. Nursing homes, especially in the 1980s, were not scrutinized the way hospitals were. And that secrecy, that quiet insulation from the outside world, became the pair's shield. Kathy later told investigators that Gwen turned the killings into a twisted kind of game. Sometimes Gwen picked the resident. Sometimes she told Kathy to choose. Sometimes she framed it as a test of loyalty, a way for Kathy to prove her devotion. Gwen would whisper things like, "If you really love me, you'll help me," turning homicide into an expression of commitment. The fourth victim barely had time to resist. A pillow pressed down just long enough. A moment of panic. A lull afterward where Gwen wiped sweat from her forehead and Kathy stood frozen, unable to tell her to stop, unable to walk away. The fifth and final officially recognized victim was someone both women had cared for tenderly in the past. A small, frail woman whose hands trembled when she spoke. A resident who trusted them enough to smile whenever they entered the room. That trust was the last thing she ever saw. Later, Kathy would insist she try to pull one away, that she beg her to stop, that she cried afterward in the supply closet. But other aides recalled no tears, no sudden changes in behavior, nothing that suggested anything was remotely wrong. If guilt existed, it stayed buried. The unraveling began, as these things often do, with small observations. Another nurse noticed Gwen joking strangely about death. A supervisor questioned why Gwen and Kathy always worked the same parts of the floor together. A resident's family commented on how quickly their mother had declined. Individually, these observations meant nothing. Together, they formed the earliest threads of suspicion. But the real break came not from Alpine Manor itself, but from the collapse of Gwen and Kathy's relationship. Their romance, once intense and intoxicating, disintegrated into jealousy and resentment. Gwen found a new partner. Kathy, angry and alone, confided in someone outside the nursing home, someone who wasn't bound by the unspoken rules of workplace loyalty. That person went to police. At first, the accusation sounded impossible. 5 murders in a nursing home? 2 nurses' aides causing deaths that doctors believed were natural? Detectives were skeptical, but when they began digging, a pattern emerged. 5 deaths on the same shifts. 5 victims who had not been considered terminal. 5 charts signed by the same supervisors. 5 bodies buried with no autopsies. Interviews with staff revealed behavior that suddenly seemed different in hindsight. When laughing about death, Kathy trailing behind her like a shadow. And when investigators questioned Kathy directly, something cracked. She confessed, not calmly, not with cold precision, but in a nervous rush, as if everything she'd been suppressing finally erupted at once. She implicated Gwen entirely, painting herself as a follower, a manipulated accomplice too afraid to resist. Whether that version was the full truth remains debated to this day. Gwen, when arrested, denied everything. She insisted Kathy was lying. That Kathy was vengeful. That Kathy was the killer. But Kathy had already given police detailed descriptions, times, methods, exact moments of suffocation or smothering that investigators later confirmed aligned with staffing logs. With 2 stories and 5 unexhumed victims, detectives had to rely on statements, patterns, and the quiet corridors where everything had taken place. There were no fingerprints, no forensic evidence, no witnesses. Just words, and 5 deaths that shouldn't have happened. In the end, both women were convicted, Kathy for second-degree murder and Gwen for first-degree. They received long sentences, with Gwen facing life without parole. But even after convictions, Alpine Manor remained haunted, not by ghosts, but by unanswered questions. Were there truly only 5 victims? Or had there been more that no one recognized as homicide? Had Kathy really been a passive accomplice? Or was she more involved than she admitted? Had Gwen truly acted alone, with Kathy as a reluctant witness? Or had the dynamic been more balanced than testimony suggested? In the long, dim hallways where frail residents once slept, the story became something whispered among staff long after the trials ended. A reminder of how vulnerable the elderly can be, how easy it is for danger to hide behind soft voices and familiar faces, how violence can take place in the most compassionate settings without anyone noticing. In the end, the silence of Alpine Manor, the same silence that had allowed the murders to go undetected, became the darkest part of the story. Because in that quiet, the boundary between care and harm had disappeared completely.